Hello again. I'm going to work through a similar set of slides that Michelle just did, but focused on the adult pulmonary embolism quality initiative. And I think this will have particular relevance, ideally as a setup, kind of an order to our guest speaker who's going to close out our day, Jeff Barnes, who's going to be talking on the kind of state of the evidence around how pulmonary embolism is interacting with COVID. And we'll talk a little bit more about those details in a bit here. But first, let's talk about a few slides here. So similar to what Michelle just showed on the pediatric respiratory measure, this is a similar graph looking at diagnostic yield for cohort 1 sites. So this is the group of hospitals who have been most long running on improvement. Time zero is when they started incorporating this quality initiative into their performance measure, so the P for P. And we're looking over the course of several years here, broken down by months. So the orange is the mean. Basically, that's the diagnostic yield average. And you can see the month-to-month variation in the light blue as that diagnostic yield varies over the period of time. And then within those are the confidence intervals, the gray bands, the lower and outer. This is a statistical process control chart. So what we're looking to do here in particular is identify when performance changes in more of a rigorous manner, and so can determine if we've had an improvement or a worsening of our baseline. And actually what you see over time with the cohort 1 sites is improvement in diagnostic yield, I suppose, despite some of the pressures from the pandemic. We started at a rate that's just under around 9%, getting closer to then 10%, and now around 11%, which is really awesome and encouraging. We're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into the pulmonary embolism quality initiative. One of the things that some of you may not know is that a couple of years ago, we began collecting information about are we having additional findings on that chest CT scan that was done for the indication in part for pulmonary embolism. This was in part responding to some feedback that received from many of you about, well, a lot of times we're doing these CT scans not just for pulmonary embolism, but to make other diagnoses. And therefore we wanted to understand, how often that's happening, and use that information to incorporate into, our understanding of the quality improvement work. We showed this information probably about 2 years ago to everybody. And basically now that we have even more data, we're showing it again. Similar table. You can see again in rank order how often we're finding various important things. Recognize that the percentages won't add up to 100 because you can have more than one finding in any given CT scan. I think probably most informative to me is always that we generally find on scans nothing, at least that's relevant to how we might care for our patient. Certainly, we do scans importantly when the evidence suggests we should be testing for PE. But a lot of times we'll test for PE, we generally find about half the time that the scan is negative. I think pneumonia is interesting. I sort of have the sense anecdotally that we sometimes end up doing a test like a CT scan in addition to pulmonary embolism, but in addition to other things. And oftentimes, pneumonia is on that list of things that people are looking for, feeling that a standard chest x-ray may not always make that diagnosis. Pulmonary pleural effusion's on there too. It's something that we collect. My personal take on this is It's not really an important finding that we need to do a CT scan for. Usually it's not the kind of finding that makes a difference in the care decisions we make in the emergency department. But it's on there, and we do make that finding on scans as well. All right, so I'm gonna stop with this figure, same figure that Michelle introduced a little bit ago. Across the horizontal axis are months. The blue bars are the cases of COVID in our registry over time. And you can certainly see the waves of the pandemic as they impacted the emergency department in the case volumes that we were experiencing. And then we overlaid that in the gray line and the orange line diagnostic yield for the chest CT scans on patients with COVID, that's the gray line, and without COVID is the orange line. I think it's hard to draw confident conclusions here. I think it's interesting. I think one of the challenges here is we're not exactly holding constant things like the denominator of patients that we're worried about pulmonary embolism on, or the number of patients coming in with COVID. You know, those things are variable and constantly moving. I think it's telling that at the start of the pandemic, the diagnostic yield for patients with COVID was quite high. My own sort of impression of that, as I reflect back on the pandemic experience when I was working, is, you know, we were pretty reticent to do things like chest CT scans on patients with COVID. We were worried about contaminating the scanner, for example. We had uncertainty about how to protect ourselves, and worried about transitioning patients in and out of pressure rooms, for example. And so I think we probably had a much higher threshold for doing a CT scan on patients with COVID at that time, which is probably why the diagnostic yield was so high. But as we progressed and got, I think, more comfortable with taking care of COVID patients, I think my general impression here is the diagnostic yield is actually lower likely than on the population without COVID. But, you know, our test thresholds, I think, are constantly changing as we try to understand what the evidence suggests we should be doing, the risk of thromboembolism in patients with COVID, and staying on top of on the evidence on that. But I certainly appreciate any kinds of other conclusions that people might draw from this this figure as well. And definitely this kind of figure sets up the conversation that we're about to have with our guest speaker momentarily.